Hi everyone, welcome back to our channel. Bex here today to talk about the books that I managed to finish during Nonfiction November. It was a pretty successful reading month for me. I finished 4 books and started a 5th, which is definitely better than my average. So I'm obviously here to talk about how those books went, whether or not I liked them. So stick around if you want to hear those opinions. The first book that I finished was the one that I said was a priority in my TBR, and that is The Children's Blizzard by David Laskin. This was my pick for the style prompt because of the interesting style of the cover with this sort of cut that they did, I believe to make it look like a snowdrift, because this is a book about weather and snow. This book spends a lot of time talking about the weather that impacted people living in Minnesota, the Dakota Territories, Iowa, Nebraska in the late 1800s on this specific day in 1888 when an Arctic airflow kind of collided with this other system and created this really intense blizzard that ended up killing a lot of people, particularly children, because the children were trying to leave school to get home to safety, and many of them perished because they got disoriented and couldn't find their way home. So there are moments in this book that are very intense. However, the build up to it took a long time. The author spends a lot of time setting up who these people are, where these pioneers came from, how they sort of set up their communities, whether they're living in a town or living more in the country. And I found that beginning very slow because it was a lot of names and telling us where people had come from, their journeys to get there, how unforgiving the land is. There were elements of it that I thought were definitely important to have in there, but I think it was a bit too much. There were a lot of names of people and their children, and a lot of the names are very similar because they were coming from different communities. So at a certain point, I kind of stopped trying to follow who people were and figured at a certain point I'd just sort of learn as the story went on, and that more or less happened. Once things started to build to this blizzard, and we have these people in the weather stations kind of reporting on the steep temperature drop and this bad weather that's coming, I could feel the tension ramping up. I felt myself getting pulled into the story more. And so that was the part that I really enjoyed, was that the building of the tension and then the actual like burst of what happened, when it hit, where these people were, how they survived, the decisions that they made, those sorts of things. I was there for the people's stories, their experiences. I also did not care for the amount of time spent on weather in this. Really getting into the nitty-gritty of how a storm like this can come to be. And because that wasn't why I was reading this book, I did not find myself being very engaged with those parts. My eyes were glazing over a bit. So I was pushing through those bits to get to the big bang towards the like mid end of this book. If you're someone that likes reading about weather, you have an interest in that sort of thing, this book would be a really good combination for you because there is so much about that topic mixed in with the sort of social aspect and how that can affect people and communities. But if you're really here like I was for the stories of the people and the build-up, it's going to be a little bit of a slog at times. So I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars for that reason. I'm glad I read it. I just wish it had been a little bit better. The second book that I finished was We Have Always Been Here by Samra Habib. This was my pick for the treatment prompt because this focuses on the treatment of refugees, of Ahmadi Muslims, and also when you're a queer individual. This is a memoir that follows her life from a young age, being born in Pakistan, growing up there for at least the first number of years of her life, and then her family comes to Canada as refugees because they are Ahmadi Muslims, so they're being persecuted. So they come to Canada to escape that. And then, of course, dealing with life in Canada and how different it is and kind of what her parents went through, but also very much what she went through. This spans the very beginning of her life until basically present day, because Samra's still relatively young, but she's had a very interesting life. And I did find myself getting pulled into her story, especially once she came to Canada and she was kind of growing up and able to make more decisions on her own. That was when I really started getting into the story. She was actually in an arranged marriage that she managed to get out of. And so that entire storyline was very interesting to me because that's not something I've ever had to deal with. There are just a lot of things in her story that are so different from mine that I really wanted to keep reading to see where she ended up, the decisions that she made. Not only her life, but even just her attitude and the things that she likes is just so different from me. So it was really giving me the opportunity to step into somebody else's mind who looks at things so differently, likes very different things than me, and sort of how that led her down such a different path in her life, but it made for an interesting story. The one downside with this was that I found the sequences of events a bit confusing. Like the timeline didn't always make sense to me because it wasn't written in that, like, here's year 1 of my life, year 2, and so on and so forth. She has different chapters that generally follow a storyline from when she's young to present day, but she does bounce around a bit because she's pulling on things that are relevant to sort of what she's focusing on in that chapter. And sometimes she would mention something, like there was one particular moment where she mentioned a story about stuff that happened to her in Montreal. And then in a chapter that followed that, like later on, she mentioned how it was for a different thing. She was talking about how it was her first time going to Montreal, and that confused me a bit because she had already talked about being in Montreal for something else. It's just the storyline could get a little confusing, but at the same time, it's sort of, she was pulling relevant things to fit what she was talking about in that chapter. So overall, a very good experience with this book, and I would recommend it if you are interested in it. It's a very fast read. I think I read it over about 5 days, and I probably could have, read it in less time, but that's definitely 5 days for a book for me is pretty good these days. So if you are interested in it, it's absolutely worth picking up. I gave this a 4.5 out of 5 stars. The third book that I finished was actually an audiobook that wasn't on my original TBR. I wasn't sure if I was going to pick one of, so I didn't mention it, but I did end up listening to So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. This is a very well-known book. It's had a lot of buzz on BookTube. Ijeoma writes in a very friendly, approachable way. So it's dealing with very complicated concepts, but she is taking examples and kind of breaking it down for you so that it's very easy to understand. At the beginning, I was a little hesitant because I was a little trying to find the groove of the audiobook, I think, and I was almost wondering if I should get the physical text because then I could mark it up. But I eventually found the groove of the book, and I ended up really enjoying it and getting some good things out of it. This is a great book if you're getting into the basics of how to talk about race and you're trying to understand concepts or words that are being mentioned around you and you're not exactly sure what they are. This gives you a great base for that. I think I had a decent to good understanding of everything that she spoke about in here. What I was really looking for were tips and ideas for how to respond to somebody when they said something racist, whether they knew it or not, and kind of how to move forward from there. Like, what's the next step when you do confront somebody about something they said? I thought she did a great job of giving examples that were applicable, and maybe it wasn't something that I had necessarily experienced, but I could think of similar situations that I had seen or even been a part of, and how I could respond if they were to happen in some form in the future, how I could respond better in, moving forward. What's the best way to approach somebody and sort of push that envelope a little bit to make them understand why what they're doing is wrong. Since this did give me what I was looking for, I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. I think there is a lot in here that would be great for a lot of different people, and because it's not a super long audiobook, you could really take a lot of it in. If you're thinking about reading this book, I would definitely recommend it. I think there is a benefit to having the physical text because you could bookmark certain passages that you think might be very helpful or relevant to you. With the audiobook, that wasn't quite as easy, but even though I was listening to it, I still got a lot out of this. The final book that I finished was Chernobyl Prayer by Svetlana Alexievich. This was my choice for the collection prompt because this is a collection of monologues. So Svetlana is focusing on people from Belarus. So the explosion in the Chernobyl plant was actually in the Ukraine, but the way that the wind blew and the fact that it was in the northern Ukraine, a lot of that radioactive toxic air went into Belarus, and Svetlana is from there. So she is talking to a lot of people from that area and sort of the effect that it had on her country. There were certain monologues in here, certain details that were very familiar to me just from past readings that I've done and also from the HBO TV show. The entire first monologue is from Ludmila Ignatenko, and she's the wife of the firefighter Vasily Ignatenko, whose story is prominently featured in the show. So reading that entire bit was very familiar to me. There are other points in here where there's information and just little bits that I could picture, like the people having to go in and shoot the pets, like the cats and the dogs. That was probably one of the hardest parts to read. It was hard to watch in the show. It's really hard to read in here because you know that this is the true account. And yeah, other little bits about like children and sort of the health complications that they are dealing with, and just the entire population, how their rates of cancer have increased dramatically, their life expectancy has dropped so much, and just the general suffering that these people have gone through in here. There's a lot of references to the war, as in like the Second World War, and people sort of comparing that but also contrasting it with Chernobyl, and how it's like the one other thing that they can think of that was as catastrophic and affected them as much was the Second World War. So there's a lot of mentions of that in here. This was as difficult as I was expecting it to be. I was a bit worried that the way the monologues would go, some of them I wouldn't enjoy as much, and that is exactly what happened. Those monologues that were a bit more abstract, I wasn't as into. The ones that were more concrete and talking about a specific thing, like having to leave their house or a health concern, or in their job, like trying to, you know, wave a flag and let people know what was happening and being shut down, like those sorts of things I enjoyed reading about more. So there were parts where I kind of struggled a little bit with it, and there were other parts where I flew through it. It just kind of depended on who the specific monologue was. I think this is just a very unique way of putting a book together. This is Alexievich's like signature style. I've never read anything like this before, so I am glad that I finally got to it. I just think that, yeah, overall it's not quite a thing that works for me, but there were parts of this book that I really, really enjoyed reading, and it is very depressing. So it's gotta be in a pretty good headspace to read this. But I'm very glad that this exists, and I got a lot of kind of extra information that I didn't have before. One of the things that surprised me from this was the amount of people that actually traveled to the exclusion zone, to around Pripyat, because they were maybe going through things in their country that they were trying to escape, or they just wanted to be left alone. And so after things kind of died down, they ended up coming into that area and living there. And these people that chose to be there, not because they lived there beforehand and they were trying to go back to their house, but because they knew that they wouldn't be bothered if they moved to that place. I thought that was one of the coolest things that I hadn't really considered before. I gave this 4 stars on Goodreads, but I'd probably say it was more like a 3.5 out of 5. The book that I started but didn't finish was 1776 by David McCullough. I read the first 41 pages of the book, so I did make some headway, but there's still a bit to go. There's so many notes at the back of the book that I actually marked where the regular text ends, so it's not nearly as long as you think it would be. The first chapter of this was so boring. It was in Parliament in the UK, and it was about King George and the different MPs and them trying to decide like how they're going to tackle this American problem of them rebelling. There were so many names, and it was like, oh, this person thought this, and this person who was known for this thought this, and I was just like, oh god, okay, I really need to get through this chapter and hopefully it'll get better. And I did get through it, and it did get a bit better because then we started focusing on people in America and what they were doing and how the soldiers were being amassed and George Washington and all that. So it's getting better. I'm not like super into it yet, but I'm gonna keep going with it for sure. And then there's one book that I didn't get to. I did not get to Untapped: The Scramble for Africa's Oil. This was my industry pick, and it just was the one that just sort of fell to the wayside. I wanted to prioritize this because this is a book that I really wanted to read this year, so Untapped will have its day at another point. That is how my nonfiction November went. Let me know how it went for you down below. How many books did you manage to get through? Do you have any new favorites? Do you have any thoughts on what I said about the books that I read? Please feel free to let me know down below. As always, all of our links are in the down bar. You can go check those out if you feel so inclined. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you later.